You're listening to Skills World, the podcast. News, views, reviews and interviews in association with FE News. Hello and welcome to Skills World, the podcast. I'm Tom Bewick and it's great to be in Northern Ireland this week at Belfast, where I'm visiting OCN Northern Ireland, and I'm joined by its Chief Executive Officer, Martin Flynn. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Tom. Welcome to Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Well, I always feel like I get such a great welcome whenever I come here, and especially when I just name drop the fact that my father was born in Belfast in 1950. So there's an obvious connection there.
Fantastic.
Martin, tell me about OCN Northern Ireland and what your role is really here as not just Chief Executive, but also as a regulated awarding organisation, the responsible officer.
Yeah, sure. So Open College Network Northern Ireland is one of the leading awarding bodies in Northern Ireland. We offer professional and technical qualifications from entry level right up to and including level 5. And we offer those qualifications to a whole range of sectors throughout Northern Ireland. That includes further education colleges, it includes community and voluntary organisations, schools, and also health trusts.
So it's a really broad remit. I mean, you're delivering to employers, to learners across Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. How would you describe the landscape here in terms of schools, education, vocational training, both in terms of its perhaps similarities with other parts of the United Kingdom, but importantly, what are the key differences?
I think in Northern Ireland, there's two main differences at present. First of all, we have our own devolved assembly in Northern Ireland, which is responsible for creating its own policy and legislation in Northern Ireland. And we also have our own independent regulator, Qualifications regulator, which is CCEA regulation. And they're both responsible for academic qualifications and responsible for the regulation of P's and T's.
So is it fair to say that CCA is, or CCEA I think is described here as well, is similar to Ofqual and SQA and Qualifications Wales? Is it sort of one of the four regulators across the United Kingdom?
Absolutely, Tom, yes. It would be very similar in terms of their monitoring of the general conditions of regulation, broadly very similar to the other nations throughout the UK. They also have an awarding body function, which is to award qualifications for GCSEs and A-levels in Northern Ireland.
So they're a sort of state provider of certain qualifications, but importantly they're also operating within a open market here in Northern Ireland, of which clearly OCN is a participant in that market.
That's right, yeah.
Demographics wise, just paint a picture of what the size of the market here is in Northern Ireland.
Okay, so currently Northern Ireland has a population of approximately 1.8 million learners, or people living. In terms of qualifications market, there are 99 awarding bodies currently operate throughout Northern Ireland. Now, in comparison to England, that equates to 158 awarding bodies in England. So the market is much smaller than England, but a lot of the awarding bodies that do operate in Northern Ireland also have that dual recognition with Ofqual, SQA and also Qualification Wales.
Perhaps with the context of OCN's priorities here in Northern Ireland, I mean, you talked about the relative smaller size of the Northern Ireland market for learners and for qualifications, but are there, other things that keep you awake at night about changes in qualifications policy, not just here in Northern Ireland, but arguably across the UK, which ultimately are going to have an impact, aren't they, on your learners and on the market here in Northern Ireland? Yeah,
I think it's a very good point. I think that with the many reforms that are happening in England in terms of the apprenticeships, trailblazers, T-levels, ultimately there will be an impact on Northern Ireland. And I think that is a concern of the departments for education, the Department of Economy, and also CCEA regulation in Northern Ireland, because what we're finding very recently is that a lot of awarding bodies are actually withdrawing from the Northern Ireland market, and some of them are withdrawing their qualification offer in Northern Ireland. I think some of the reasons for that, well, one of them in particular is down to the financial viability of some English awarding bodies offering qualifications in Northern Ireland. Our market is so small in comparison to other regions of the UK that it's just not financially viable for them to continue that offer. And what our departments are doing at the moment is working with CCEA regulation to ensure that there is no market failure when it comes to the professional and technical qualification offer in Northern Ireland.
Martin, as well as being Chief Executive here at OCN, of course, you chair on behalf of the Federation of Awarding Bodies, about 90-odd AOs that, of course, are active here in the Northern Ireland market. So, you're quite close to lots of issues and challenges. And you referred to one there about, in effect, changes afoot in other parts of the UK. We're thinking particularly about the technical education reforms in England are potentially going to have an adverse impact here in Northern Ireland. And you talked there about market failure, but in plain English, essentially that means that if there are derecognition of qualifications in England, which arguably is a much bigger market, what we're potentially going to see is less choice here in Northern Ireland for learners and employers, because it won't necessarily be economically viable, as you quite rightly say, to provide us qualifications. So what's the solution to that? Because one of the dynamics, as you pointed out at the start of this interview, around devolution is, of course, the different parts of the UK are perfectly within their rights to sort of go their own way. And England's doing that around T-levels. It's doing it in relation to the apprenticeship reforms. But it's clearly having an impact on opportunities here in Northern Ireland. Yeah,
and I think, no, you're absolutely right. But I think one of the issues is that in Northern Ireland, we still map our qualifications to the National Occupational Standards, or is referred to as NOS. Likewise in Wales. And with a lot of the apprenticeships in England and a lot of the changes, what it means for those awarding bodies that operate across the three nations is that they have to tweak or change their qualifications to suit three different markets. And obviously there's a financial burden on those organisations to do that. So they have to think very, very carefully about the potential market in Northern Ireland before submitting a qualification there. In terms of our regulator here in Northern Ireland and our government departments, they're acutely aware of the possibility of a reduced offer in Northern Ireland, and they have set up a qualifications access project to specifically look at this issue to make sure and address that there is no shortfall in the availability of professional qualifications in Northern Ireland.
And just give us a flavour of what type of qualifications potentially could be at risk of disappearing from the marketplace in Northern Ireland if, for example, these reforms going on elsewhere result in AOs pulling out of providing those particular occupational routes.
Yep. Well, one recent example is the review of the hospitality apprenticeships in Northern Ireland. That originally started off, if I'm correct, with around 5 to 6 AOs expressing an interest in developing qualifications specific for Northern Ireland. And at present, there are 2 AOs still left in terms of developing those qualifications and putting them forward for accreditation. Now, obviously, OCN NI are one of those awarding bodies that will be heavily involved in the review and submission of future apprenticeships here in Northern Ireland. And obviously, the reason for that is that it is our priority to ensure that we develop qualifications for the people that live and work in Northern Ireland as their main function.
Absolutely. Looking across at working with other regulators, obviously you mentioned CCEA there, that's responsible for regulation and qualifications here in Northern Ireland. To what extent do you feel that the regulators are working collaboratively enough to try and, I suppose, smooth over some of these obvious challenges around devolution? I mean, of course, one would sign up to devolution as a good thing, but, you mentioned the national occupational standards there. They used to be genuinely national in that they covered all 4 nations. Effectively, with the Institute for Apprenticeships now in England and qualifications no longer in apprenticeships, we don't have frameworks, therefore we don't have NOS underpinning those standards. There's a different process around competency. I mean, all this is getting very, very complex and kind of confusing. And it sort of feels almost like potentially, Northern Ireland is a bit of collateral damage in some of those changes. I mean, clearly England has set out to do that in terms of its policy divergence. But do you think there's, as chair of the Northern Ireland group here with the other AOs, do you think there's some scope for greater collaboration across the regulators to try and look at some of these issues? And what would you like to see?
Yeah, it is problematic, the fact that there are different submission processes for each regulator. Now, CCEA regulation would be very proactive to try and reduce the burden on awarding bodies submitting qualifications in Northern Ireland. And it's great to see that they have a shared platform in terms of the qualifications portal. So they share that with Ofqual, right, which means that if an awarding body is submitting a qualification for use in England and Northern Ireland, it's done via the same mechanism. So that, I think that's one positive. I think the other positive is that as chair of the awarding body forum, our regulator here and our government departments engage with the awarding bodies that operate in Northern Ireland. So they would attend the meetings on a quarterly basis to update different AOs across the UK on changes in policy direction, ongoing consultations, and to also receive feedback from awarding bodies to try and find out what are the issues that they face when trying to offer qualifications in the Northern Ireland market.
Finally, Martin, you referred earlier on to the Stormont Assembly. I think most of those observing politics in Northern Ireland have known that for some time that has not been up and running. What that means in practice is, of course, day to day, there are not ministers in the executive who are making decisions that affect the people of Northern Ireland. Are you hopeful that that situation can be resolved in the not too distant future? And indeed, if it is resolved and we see the Assembly up and running and therefore an executive, what would be your top sort of 2 or 3 priorities for the incoming Minister for Skills, Education, Employment? I'm not quite sure of the title of the minister here in Northern Ireland. They differ across the UK. But, importantly, if you're writing their job description coming in, what would it look like?
Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't tell you whether the Assembly will be up and running anytime soon. And obviously, I am aware that there is an election, most likely happening around December time. I think the date's the 12th of December is being floated at the moment. Yes. So we will have MLAs elected. Whether we have an Assembly by then, I don't know. I would like to see the Assembly back up and running and some policy decisions being taken, because I am ultimately aware that our local government departments have been working hard at creating policy documents that are sitting waiting for potential ministerial approval. So it would be good to get the Assembly back up and running again. In terms of what my asks would be for a Northern Ireland skills agenda, I think that it's really important that we have a skills agenda that looks at the professional and technical market and gives it the same equal comparability with the academic market in Northern Ireland. I think we need to really all work together to work with employers and ensure that people who leave school with few to no GCSEs and pursue a professional and technical career, that they are actually held in the same esteem as those learners with the A-star grades and who move on to university. And I think it's really important that we recognise that as a society so that no one gets left behind.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but let's end on that note of nobody being left behind. Martin Flynn, Chief Executive Officer of OCN Northern Ireland, thanks for joining Skills World today.
Thank you, Tom.
Sign up to Skills World at www.fenews.co.uk.